Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 87 Specialties that Shine, Metallics and More. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties there. I know we're starting about a couple minutes late overall. Still having some issues with the mic, so if you're having trouble hearing me, let me know. If something's going completely wrong and it's just not showing up for you, definitely say so in the comments. Otherwise, hopefully we're on the road. Looks like everything's fine, but StreamYard every once in a while has fun with me and with you and with our live timing. However, now that I'm on and it seems like you guys can hear me, here's hoping that we can have a good show. We have something interesting to talk about, something fun. Today, we're not going to get overly technical necessarily. We'll talk a little bit about execution. We will talk a little bit about digitizing. We will get into reflective materials. We're going to get into metallic threads and just talk about adding some shine, shimmer, and gloss to our embroidery to make things look awesome. We all know that I am a big fan of using the natural shine and shadows that are present even in our polyester and rayon threads that we conveniently have already in progress with any embroidery we do. Our usual embroidery is already shiny. It has a lovely texture and sheen, and we can use the way that satin stitches and fill stitches and different configurations of stitches look and give us a different kind of reflectivity, that play of light. However, people are more and more interested in using multiple kinds of specialty threads and effects to make things even more interesting with the play of light. And we have never had as many options as we do today. I can't tell you how much more there is in comparison to when I started. And even the concept of metallic thread was, hey, maybe you have a couple of colors of metallic thread. Most people were only using metallic gold, metallic silver on occasion, and usually not even that many colors of it. Now, every color under the sun, multiple kinds of metallic, multiple kinds of twist threads, all sorts of foils and films. And it's not just in the home and craft market or the art market, even though you guys do some awesome stuff with that. It's in the commercial market. And now we have things like not only reflective materials, which we were used to for safety reasons, but we now have true reflective, and we'll talk about this term later, retro reflective threads. And also, I've been opened up to other kinds of shiny applications, stuff that I haven't done before as much or seen as much. Like the lovely Lisa Shaw made a really cool patch with Mylar this last week that I really enjoyed. And I wasn't somebody who really has been into that as a material, but having looked at some of the ways that it's been used, and also a companion of mine in my job, compatriot Jim from Embrilliance, has made some really cool ornaments and other things out of Mylar that I was so shocked to find. It gave you a metallic look without any of the difficulty of running classic metallic threads. So there's all of these different options for making things shiny, for making things bright and shimmery and glimmery, and all the things that we love about not only embroidery, but about the play of light over embroidery and how we can amp those up. As you can see, I was working on technical stuff right to the last minute. I'm not buttoned up and not ready to rock, but hey, we finally have the mic rolling. We have everybody here. Let's say hi to some of the folks who are here, and then let's get into the ways we manage metallic threads, the ways we should work on digitizing for those, the different options we have for shine, and the way we can handle those things, what retro reflective materials are, and we'll see how much we can get through. There's a lot of fun stuff there. I'll show you some images, I'll show you some articles, and we'll get into it. But let's say hi to some folks first. Cindy King says, good afternoon. Hope you got my thank you email. Hey, just so you guys know, I'll go ahead and share it. Cindy was trying to resize the design, and actually you should thank Brian Bailey, Creative from Brilliance, because our software has the ability to do something kind of cool, which is stitch processing, which instead of turning things back into objects, it actually processes them by recognizing what kind of stitch type is there and adding in stitches to maintain densities. I employed that and showed that to Cindy because she had some issues with resizing a design that was hard to recreate or couldn't be recreated in time. And you know what? You got to love when people do good technology. Thank you, Brian. so thank Brian. I just use the tools. Gail says, and Gail, thank you. That's so awesome for you to help. Gail of Kingsbury Crafts, let's give you a plug, says, happy Friday, everyone. Happy Friday to you. Frank Dunn from over in the UK. Good evening, all. Good evening to you, Frank. And as always, thank you for being an awesome member of the community and sharing and helping with everything. I have like a secret producer in the UK, and it's Frank, because he shares all of my posts everywhere, and I really appreciate it. Tom Farr of Buzzards Bay and doing his consulting now. Awesome embroiderer who's doing all kinds of crazy techniques and great stuff. And you should see how he does patch attachment. He's the king of showing people that stuff for sure. Just is out in Sweden saying hi. Love to have you in. Lyndon says, good afternoon from North Carolina. Looking forward to the show. Happy to have you here. Darren says, good evening from Bulgaria. So thank you, Darren. Hopefully I got that right for your name, but thank you for being here. And glad to have people from across the pond and everywhere listening in. Cindy says, it sounds looks fine. That's good. Joe Rita says, hello from Formula One Race in Austin, Texas. Hey, Joe Rita, happy to have you here. Seeing some awesome work you're doing with textures and stitch types, and I love it. Jeff Fuller of the Embroidery Nerd Fuller Embroidery Works is here, and he says he blames Matt Enderley, also of the Embroidery Nerd and Patch Phrase, was talking about some metallic thread last night, and it got me on a metallic kick. Not just because of Matt. I actually had been talking to someone else about trouble they were having with metallics very recently. They were having thread breaks running metallic thread. And having difficulty with their thread path. And we talked about all these different things that I'm about to share with you today about how I've managed problems with metallic thread. And also because we have different kinds of metallic thread than we used to. Back in the day, there was pretty much a couple different kinds of thread, and they weren't vastly different. The construction of the thread was about the same. We're going to talk about that more, but in the current last couple of years, we have different kinds of threads that are constructed slightly differently, that are treated and coded differently to make them run in a better way. So we're going to talk about all this kind of stuff. Like I said, this is going to be a loose episode, a fun episode where we talk about some fun creative options, and then we talk a little bit about how to manage and tame these things. But like I said, it's not just Matt's fault. You shouldn't just blame Matt, but Matt certainly was one more, let's say, nail in the coffin is probably the spooky season way of saying it, for making me want to talk about metallic threads again. I've talked about them quite a lot because I've had a great deal of experience with maybe not so nice combinations of, let's say, not the best equipment, not in the best repair, working with metallic threads that were a little easier to break than others. And that really can cause some issues and can bring some headaches and heartaches for everybody. So yeah, we'll talk about that for sure. We also have Baby Jean coming in saying, good evening to you all. Rafal is in from Scotland. Awesome digitizing coming out of Rafal. So thank you for being here and talking about stuff with everyone and sharing your incredible work. Cindy says she bought a few pieces of Mylar, but haven't tried it yet. Yeah, that's the thing. I saw this piece from Lisa, which kind of made me want to talk about it. And also, like I said, Jim has done some really fun stuff with Mylar ornaments that we've done, and people love them. And here's the thing that I'm going to say about Mylar and it makes me upset because I have done so much work with colored metallics that didn't run very well, especially in the holiday season when everybody wants to do sparkly, fun stuff. And especially if you're doing craft stuff. Most of my stuff was super commercial. However, the holiday season for me always ended up being jobs that we did for customers who were important customers for the rest of the year with regular decoration, who suddenly really wanted to do ornaments for their company, who wanted to do stockings for everybody in the company, who had a bunch of gifts for people in their family, but hey, they're a really important purchaser for a big company, so we're doing a bunch of stockings and weird gifts. And it meant a lot of work with metallic threads that weren't the best. And so, yeah, the thing about Mylar that kills me was that I saw a piece that Jim did where it looked like he had colored metallic thread in about 4 colors, and it's really sparkly and gorgeous. And I'm looking going, man, that looks crazy. How did you ran this on this little home style machine? And I know you didn't put a good needle in it or anything. And I'm looking at it and the eye is tricking me. I'm looking at these loose fills over this Mylar. The thread was standard polyester thread. The Mylar was producing all the shine. We had these low density fills over the Mylar. Mylar is shining through in between. The thread was just giving a little hint of color to the eye, and none of the threads were metallic. And after I saw that, I was like, meh, no, didn't like that, man. I didn't like that. That made me upset because I was like, oh man, to think you could get that much shine out of something that doesn't run through the machine and cause issues. And this is, like I said, before the new metallics that we have recently. But the truth of the matter being like, I had spent so much time trying to get that level of metallic on something. And if I had known that I could just give somebody better laundry instructions, and that's the other thing I'll talk about with Mylar in a minute. If I could have gotten somebody better laundry instructions and handed them a Mylar thing where I just had to do essentially a rip away applique type procedure to it, I absolutely would have if I'd known better. But hey, it's not for everything. It's really for loose fills over a filled area. Things like Mylar applied films. You put them underneath a loose fill. We can talk about that again later. But that's what they're for. So large areas and shapes that we're trying to fill in with something sparkly, we can throw a Mylar sheet underneath a loose fill or stippling. And the thing is, it's not adhesive. It's not something that's going to adhere to the garment. So it has to be stitched down over the kind of the entirety of the Mylar. It has to have some kind of stitching over it. And I wouldn't do it for like lettering. Now, you can prove me wrong on this and maybe show me like a loose satin over Mylar, but I think it looks more impressive to me, or at least that effect that I got that blew my mind was really on the light fills. light fills Mylar under them. And a lot of the work I did was actually monograms and names with metallic thread. And the monograms and names, the good thing about those, usually we have nice long satin stitches and aren't going to cause breakage and problems like that. However, when we get into really small text, we can end up with the same kind of problems you have with any sort of small stitching and metallic thread when they have trouble. So it is certainly one of those things to think about for sure. But yeah, Mylar sheets, you would have never caught me playing with Mylar until I saw just what it could do for a design, and especially something that's not being washed or laundered or dried. Very impressive looking piece. I can see using that on a patch on a backpack all day long because it's not likely to be thrown through a washer and dryer. And that's a lot. And I talk about that with a lot of other kinds of threads and treatments. Same thing with some of the wool blends. You guys hear me talk about thick threads or the cotton threads when they're super fuzzy, or you do, let's say, that animal work, the brushed animal work. Vitor did a really good example of it that I often show, since it was one that he had at the shows in the ZSK booths. That stuff is awesome, but the laundry can cause it to be problematic because it will pill and mat and felt itself when you brush those long fibers out. Same kind of thing with the Mylar. Mylar, you're not pressing that. You're not putting a hot iron on it. You probably shouldn't be running it through a dryer unless you're really going low temps. I've heard different things about that. Conservatively, like I may talk about this again later, but we're getting into Mylar. You turn it inside out. You're going to wash it cold. You're not going to dry it. It makes it less valuable to me especially for corporate stuff. I would have to be giving someone laundry instructions, being careful about it. But interesting stuff, right? Interesting stuff. All right. And Cindy says, thank you, Brian Bailey. I concur. Thank you, Brian. Chris Christensen says, love when a day off from the job coincides with Eric's live. I'm super glad to have you here and that you're spending some time off with me. Oh man, that's right to the heart. Glad to hear that. Thank you. Bill says, I'm going to be doing my first metallic later today. In fact, starting with Madeira CR Antique Gold, but I'm going to listen to you first. Hi, Eric. Hey, you are already ahead of the game. It is expensive, and I agree. If you're speccing out Madeira CR for a job, make sure you've looked at what that cost is before you spec out the job or quote it to somebody. However, my experience has been that the Madeira CR, which is one of multiple coated metallic threads that are out there, and we're going to talk about that more. They do run through normal needles, and they run faster and smoother than the old school metallics have in my time. Old school foil wrap metallics. Now they're all foil wrapped, but the old school ones that had the foil on the outside, you can feel them. They're very rough. They have a lot of friction to them, and they break a little easier. The CR, and I would say I haven't had as much good luck with it, but I've heard the glisten is good. There's many of those that have a coating, a little bit duller, run a little smoother. So like I said, we'll get back into that. Fanny says, hi from Ghent City, Belgium. Hi, Fanny. Thank you for coming in. Hi from the UK, Sally. Glad to have you in always. And yeah, here we are. Jamie says, I play a lot. So the CR from Madeira is great. And the Super Twist, I learned the 80-12 works so much better. Yes, Super Twist. Super Twist is 30 weight. And I'll talk about that later. That is a twisted thread that has a normal polyester portion and a metallic fiber running through it. Great way to get some sparkle, but it is thicker and you need to digitize for that. If you look at Super Twist on the Madeira website, Super Twist is specifically Madeira, but there are other places that have these thick twisted threads. You will see that the target densities they're shooting for are 6 points or 0.6 mils. So another half back, 50% back from your standard 40 weight thread, full coverage density of 4 points or 0.4 millimeters. So Super Twist is awesome, but if you want to use Super Twist, you need to check out your densities. You're definitely going to have to back them down, and you may want to go for that 80-12 needle. Yeah, for sure. You run it through the 75-11, you're going to have what? More friction. You're going to have more friction for sure, and you're definitely going to find other issues that come with having that extra friction. We'll go say hi to a couple more people before we get going. John says, hi, Eric. Aspens in Colorado are bright yellow to go with today's topic. Awesome. Love aspen trees. Love Colorado, too. Baby Jean says, I just tried my first patch from Lisa. Pumpkin with Mylar. Not bad, but a learning curve. So you cut it before you stitch it out. Mylar depends. Mylar, and this is something we can talk about again later. Some people do it in a tearaway fashion where they stitch around the outside edge and tear it away. Some people cut the edges out. Some people just tear it off if they have a satin stitch around the edge. Depends. I have not done it a ton, but from the people who I saw using Mylar, there were multiple ways they handled it. Lots of people like the idea of using a full coverage satin or full coverage edge of some sort and just tearing it off the outside edge because it does tear. But that's the thing. Whenever you have a material that tears like that, then you have to realize if it is a heat press material, like when we're doing glitter flake rip away applique, part of how we give stability to something that tears like that is where it has adhesive on the back. We are adhering it to the garment by heat pressing it after the fact. Then materials like that, you don't have to worry about the tearing. If you have mylar, mylar is not going to be adhered to the garment. It's not something you're going to heat press, and you can't really heat press, it's going to melt. So mylar has to have stitching over the surface to a degree, whether that's a light stitching or a stippling. And like I said, not something I have a ton of experience with, but I have experience with similar materials. And certainly in the people who I talked to after getting interested with mylar, the recommendation is to stitch overall the area of the mylar because it is loose, and it may have, though I'll tell you this, a little bit of crinkle in the mylar just kind of looks cool to me. I'm not looking for it to look smooth, and frankly, a little bit of crinkle in it doesn't look bad. It just adds more angles to reflect some light. So I love that stuff. And Jenny says, hand sewing metallic thread and karate belt. Yay. Wow. That's, I hope you have a good thimble. A few times I've ever had to hand sew on a belt or karate belt. That's not as fun as you might think. Hope you have like a sewing palm. If you guys don't know that, anybody who's let's say sewn some heavy canvas sewing palms, you can push the needles through. It might be helpful. And in any case, let's get on to it. Let's talk about it. You guys know I usually have a links list. I do have a links list with just a couple things on it today. We have some fun, one fun thing about why people like shiny stuff, and I'm going to briefly talk about that. And there's also a couple pieces on the links list just from me talking about specialty threads. So I'll go ahead and add this up to the stream so you can see. The first thing is just that little piece about the evolutionary reason why we might think that glossy things are interesting, and I'll talk about that. And then we have a couple pieces about specialty threads. So me just talking about the types and tips and tricks, some things we're going to cover about metallic threads, why we can use them or how we can use them to get creative. And then the last one is how specialty threads can actually improve our bottom line and improve the things we offer to people. So every time I talk about specialty threads, especially when some of them are a headache or much more expensive than a standard polyester thread, somebody is quick to tell me that that's too expensive, it won't work for something. And I'm like, well, yeah, except for the specialty threads add a value that you can then charge for. Nothing works if you don't charge enough for it. Buying a more expensive garment doesn't work for your bottom line if you don't charge for it. But it will, for the particular customer who wants a high-end garment, that will actually increase your ability to sell. So same thing with specialty threads that you might want to do. So check those out. Those are in the links list right there. And I thought, some fun stuff and some useful stuff there, though not everything I'm going to talk about have I put in the links list. I think some of this is just stuff we're going to discuss, but these do have some actual concrete tips on how to handle things. Though, let me talk really briefly about that first thing. Since we're talking about shiny materials, I just thought it was funny. I mean, you've all heard of shiny object syndrome. Usually that means that people are temporarily attracted to something that is no longer, interesting. After a while, it dulls quite quickly. But so it says shiny object system or shiny object syndrome, at least when I say that. But the thing is, and it's not only human beings, it's animals in general, but human beings have a tendency to be drawn to things that are glossy. That is just a truth. We are drawn to things that are shiny and glossy. I always talk about the fact that it adds a certain sense of value and luxury to things because of associations we have. The thing is, there were actually a team of researchers who were talking about this and wanted to know more about, why are things attractive to human beings when they're glossy or shiny? And they actually went into some detail on this. So I included that article. It's an article from Fast Company. I'll go ahead and throw it up on screen. Why not? But it's an evolutionary theory for why you love glossy things. And what you find out if you go through this, it's not a perfect article or perfectly scientific, all the things you might find in here. However, it essentially turns out these scholars wanted to answer this question. And in this published university article, it turns out like not only do we find that infants with no cultural connection, so they're not going to connect it to luxury or jewelry or something or money. They're not thinking about that when they think of shiny things. They were more likely to put a glossy plate to their mouth than not, or a shiny toy to their mouth than not. And they're very excited about these things. And also it turns out that people in general just prefer shiny and glossy things. And what they also found, they think it is evolutionarily tied to our need to find water. We all know that between water and food, if you don't have water for 3 days, you're toast. Whereas you don't find food, you can stand for a while. Well, water is really important to humans. So the concept of finding a puddle of water is something that is very evolutionarily strong for us. And the concept here was that we had this primitive desire for water. There are some things that are wrong with the experiment, but the fun thing was they found that if they had people who were thirsty or reported being thirsty, they were more likely to show favoritism toward images that were glossy or glossy objects. So, like I said, not something we're going to cover in deep detail, but I thought it was funny when we're talking about shiny things and everybody says, well, I don't know, people just like shiny things. They don't always. Glossy things aren't always awesome in every context. If you're trying to read something off of a piece of glass and there's not enough, there's not enough contrast, you might like something that's matte finish better, certainly. However, it just turns out to be the case that most animals, and including the human animal, we tend to like things that are glossy and shiny and are attracted to them. And this particular set of researchers thinks that's because we all need a drink. And it turns out that, hey, everybody, I guess everybody's thirsty, and thirsty people like shiny stuff more. So I don't know. Hey, maybe we take the bar example. We're about to sell embroidery thread that is shiny, or we're starting to sell people on shiny stuff. We'll just keep dry peanuts on the counter in the showroom or something. I don't know. Suffice it to say, folks, I thought it was fun to talk about that. And you know me, I'm always game to go a little bit beyond the normal. But when we're talking about this stuff, and apparently shiny stuff, we're just thirsty. All right. So in any case, that's just funny. I think it's fun to have that stuff as part of this. I mean, we all like shiny stuff, and I talk about the cultural association certainly. Whenever I'm talking about selling specialty threads and things like that, or even talking about the execution, where I discuss carving things out of satin stitches, which tend to have all the fibers are lined up and the stitches are lined up so that we have a distinct shadow and a distinct shiny section on these pieces. We have a highlight and a shadow. Part of that is because it does give us that sense of something being like jewelry, something being valuable, something associated with things that we actually find value in. But we actually have something deeper than that that's working on us. But that's why I think metallic thread sometimes pulls this off. And I will say, in my time selling embroidery and working with embroidery with customers, when metallic threads have been the most valuable, tends to be people who are trying to associate themselves with that high-end aesthetic or with a jewelry-like aesthetic. Some of my very first work learning metallic threads was actually for a wine company. So this is a winery. They were trying to do something super high-end. They went with fairly thick, very nice sweaters. And yes, I'm talking about fully knit sweaters. So this was super fun. One of my earliest jobs where I worked on metallic threads was doing a carved, very detailed seal, which had a monogram on top of a shield with all the other appointments and mantling and stuff that most coats of arms would have, all in metallic gold thread through a sweater. So you can go ahead and say you're sorry to poor tiny brand new embroiderer Eric who had to figure that out. But the concept is we're making something that is analogous to jewelry. It has those facets. It looks like a molded piece, especially when we're using satin stitches in a way to carve designs. And the metallic thread just has a tendency to catch that light and reflect it and give us back that interest. And honestly, I made a joke about shiny object syndrome, but we know if something is glinting in the distance, we see light shining off of something, it just draws the eye. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're drawing the eye, and that's the idea. I mean, it is always good to think about why we do these things, but certainly we'll get into the why and the wherefore and what we can do and the different kinds of metallic thread. But when we think about the why, we're associating ourselves with these luxury brands. And I'll say, even in the other kinds of things that I've used to create shiny objects, a lot of them were in that same kind of association, right? The companies I can rattle off from the top of my head, like I said, high-end wineries. Certainly, we did some luxury car brands that really enjoyed the metallic thread. Funny enough, and this is repeatedly, both with rhinestones and metallic thread, dental hygienists, the concept of clean, shiny teeth often then got associated with jewelry. And by the way, jewelers as well, but with jewelry, with the concept of something that was shiny and valuable. So dental hygienists, funny enough, a bunch of dental companies were part of that. And also whenever the company itself had something shiny, they were selling. So people who did polishing services, people who sold stone for stone countertops, several of those companies, especially depending on kind of how they were marketing or where they were marketing, that shiny object syndrome, they were going for that. So the metallic thread, we know, yes, it's more expensive, but it's not like massively more expensive. It's not actually made of gold. But these people were more likely to choose metallics. Certainly, high-end golf shirts for certain golf clubs, stuff like that. There's this concept of metallic, luxury, jewelry, high-end, and also shiny objects like a shiny car, like shiny teeth, like shiny jewelry, being associated with that kind of overall luxury feeling that we're going to get from shiny materials. So there's that. Now, certainly, I think when we're talking about Mylar, when we're talking about reflectivity is safety. And also, funny enough, tech, the idea of something having technological features. The actual retroreflective materials, it's more, the conventional way we use them is for safety and visibility for construction and for workers. The other way we use them is in the concept of in the technology space, because they do have this way of looking almost otherworldly or electric or switched on when they are exposed to light and reflect it. So let's go ahead and talk about that stuff too. Let's see what we can do with that. I would say Cindy says, "Hey, I'm in the oil field. Wonder what I can make shiny." Retroreflective threads are very interesting, but expensive. Retroreflective materials, so like 3M materials, what we're usually used to. Scotch-Lite is a brand name we all know pretty well. Retroreflective materials for safety stuff. When you're doing high vis, you're already doing fluorescence, which is another bright, colorful way to handle making something more attractive to people or making something more visible. But the retroreflective threads are interesting. And I think small amounts of retroreflective added to things are really interesting too. In fact, we're going to talk about what a retroreflective thread is. It reflects light back rather than just being shiny. It doesn't just reflect some light or at an opposing angle. It reflects light back at the source of the light. So we'll talk about that again in a moment. But retroreflective threads, I also love them for outdoors. So people who need to be visible outdoors, runners. It's fantastic for runners and athletic wear to use small amounts of reflective thread in logos, or what I call bugs, sometimes small, like sleeve logos, hat side logos, hat back logos, things that are on cuffs, collar tips, little or yokes, sometimes small elements of retroreflective thread, because it's also very expensive. You want to talk about expensive, metallic thread has nothing on retroreflective threads. And I'll tell you why partially in a second, or at least you'll understand why from the construction of the things. Those are awesome. And also the pet market, people who are walking pets in the early mornings, in the later evenings, having something reflective on a pet vest, on a assistive pet, or an animal, like a help animals, patches or gear. Retroreflective thread is awesome for that. And it's an additional thing you can sell as a technical feature, something that adds actual value because it has a function that it performs that makes the garment safer, that actually adds a real feature. It's not just attractive, it makes things safer. So those are things that I think are interesting with that. But with that, let's get kind of into the actual, the nature of metallic thread, right? You guys know that I've written several articles about that, and I've showed you a couple of the older ones that are here, but some of these older articles are actually really haven't changed a lot as far as how you can handle most metallic threads. Now, what has changed somewhat, certainly, is that there are different kinds of threads available. So metallic thread is the classic shiny object that we can use for creating some sort of interest. Now, certainly there are other things. If you look at the image that we have here, this is a piece that actually has multiple kind of shiny threads being used, specialty threads. And in this particular piece, we have colored metallics. These are the classic twist metallics that you have seen before, that have the kind of exposed foils that are wrapped around a polyester core. We have the polyester core wrapped with foils, and those foils, as you can see, when we look at a metallic thread, especially, and we'll show you some images of metallic thread more tightly here. We're going to talk about some of the different kind of threads, and we'll go ahead and pop this up. If we look on this left-hand side, you may be able to see already, and I'll actually go full screen on that, that we have these wraps, and you can actually see as this kind of texture that's on the thread itself, that we have the wrap of that foil being wrapped around the core. The classic metallics tend to have a pretty heavy wrap that is certainly visible. You can see the texture to it. And if you go and look at this on a micro scale, a small satin stitch where you have really small stitches across, we take a look at those stitches, you'll almost see them being kinked. You'll see these like bends as the foil, it almost kinks instead of being smooth. It's not a round satin stitch. You'll actually see some of those sparkles because we have angles. That foil will kink on small stitch lengths, and it produces some sparkle, which is interesting, but it's also part of the problems we have with the way the stuff lays down. In any case, if we're looking at this particular piece, though, it actually has multiple shiny materials. So we have that classic foil, the classic kind of foil that we're looking for, that classic metallic in all of the colored elements that are in this acanthus leaf, that are in the center of that, the kind of rosette that's on the back of the monogram. Those things are all classic metallic threads. But you'll see the monogram itself, that's that 30 weight super twist I was talking about before and that Jamie brought up. And that is actually that's a 30 weight thread that has, it is partially like a standard finish polyester like you would expect from normal threads. But then it also has one of the strands is a metallic strand. So we just get some sparkle. In that case, that one I believe is a black with red. So there's just this little red sparkle that's coming through on top of that black. And that tends to run a little easier than the classic metallics used to. And we wanted just a little bit of sparkle. I was very fond of using these kind of super twist threads. Now, admittedly, 30 weight thread, we're going to have to back down our densities. We're going to have to be a little more careful about our stitch lengths in general, but not so much. It really ran pretty smoothly, whereas the classic metallics had a tendency to break more often if we had anything wrong with the thread path. Let's say the thread path is dirty. Let's say we're getting too much friction. And certainly if we're using a standardized 7511 needle I was using for everything else, the chances are I might be running into some friction. And if I had any loops or kinks or anything else that happened in the thread path as the metallic was spooling off, we're going to end up with a higher chance of thread breaking, especially in the old school metallics like that. So sometimes that sort of thread was awesome. Using that super twist could certainly help us get past that because it runs a little smoother, or at least it's a little easier because we're really relying on that kind of polyester portion of it. It doesn't snap as much. Even if the foil component sometimes could break, you would end up with it wouldn't unspool itself or nest itself the way that you'd sometimes have with a classic metallic. So the super twist was really cool. And this is a piece I did some time ago. But the other thing you're seeing here as part of this application in general is we have a spray of hand-placed rhinestones. Now, I'm going to be honest with you and say hand-placing rhinestones better be a pretty high-end material, because in this case, they were done with a single rhinestone tool, which is, in this case, it was a battery-operated pen-like tool that you would press on each individual rhinestone, which would, of course, it would heat up the thermoplastic adhesive on the back of that rhinestone and adhere it permanently to the piece. And yes, that also works over thread. If I were doing this at any scale, I'd be having a set of transfers made for me, or creating transfers with either a rhinestone house or in my own shop, either with the brush and bake, which is where you're using a stencil and brushing rhinestones in, or the rhinestone placing machine. I would have a transfer that was made for this design if I was doing this in any massive scale. But in a boutique setting where I'm making one piece and the piece has enough money in it that the labor is possible, you can do something like this and use rhinestones to add some additional texture, some additional levels of height, kind of dimension, and to get extra shine. But like I said, the reason this is an interesting design for me to show is that it does have multiple types of metallic in it. Classic colored metallic, you see I'm using some color contrast between the two greens that are in there. Then we have a textural contrast between the slight amount of sparkle that we're getting out of that, out of the super twist. And then we have the rhinestones, which are just the height of reflective, very shiny objects as far as this kind of decoration. We're not talking about retroreflectives. But like I said, there are problems with these things. We're talking about metallic thread, especially the classic metallic thread. The problems are fairly obvious. I mean, usually when we're using it and we're ending up with thread breaks, there's a few different things we have to work on. And it's something that I talked about in that particular article, and that I talk about in several of my articles about metallic threads. The thing is, they have changed a little bit as far as thread type. Classically, when I talk about metallic threads, these are the things that I'm worried about with execution. And what I mean by execution is once we're to the machine. We'll talk in a second about digitizing. Let's talk about the machine for a second. The first thing is, whenever we're working with metallic threads, we have to look for areas of friction and fight those areas of friction and make sure we're not having problems. I will say that in the home market especially, I've seen more people turning toward needles that allow for a larger eye. A top stitch needle is often what it's called, or it may even be specified as a metallic needle. I'm going to go ahead and show you this image. This is from Superior Threads, and this is their needle that they use. Boy, everybody has pop ads these days. I wish that wasn't always the case. But in this case, if you're looking at what their recommended top stitch needle versus a standard embroidery needle, you can see that we have this longer, larger eye to the needle. I'm not suggesting necessarily we're going out to get a bunch of specialty needles from metallic thread. And in fact, depending on thread selection, these days it's much less likely you need this. If you look at the guidelines for a lot of the metallics, even the classic metallics that are always still being available from our thread suppliers, they're not telling you to go do this. However, when you are having problems at the point of stitch formation, when you're having a lot of breaks, sometimes this can help, because what I've found is as those needles heat up with a tremendous amount of friction, sometimes we are almost cutting the thread. It's almost like we're melting through it. I find that it breaks easier as that friction happens, and as we bind up at the head of the needle, we can sometimes in that eye be binding up and breaking thread. Also, though, the friction's not just about the needle by any means. When we're having excessive friction anywhere in the thread path, I find that we're likely to have more trouble with our thread. So Yes, there's other things we're going to talk about as far as what that means. But the first thing I'm looking for from metallics is I'm going to try and not have an excessive amount of friction. If you're pulling a metallic thread through your thread path and you find that the tension is crazy, it's the next thing. It's the next thing we're going to talk about. I mean, certainly needle selection can play in it. I have found, especially on smaller machines are having issues, I've used a larger eye needle and just had less of that happening. But that's not necessary for all types of thread. If you're having a tremendous amount of trouble and you've got those classic kind of thick wrapped coiled foil threads that have that super rough texture, sometimes that needle can help with that. But in general, we're going to want to fight the friction. One of the other old school tricks I know what people did back in the day and that I was taught to do was to take a non-staining silicone spray. It's a clear lubricant spray and to spray down the cone, sometimes spray down the needles, and have that silicone helping to lubricate the path so that we're not having that kind of friction going through. So that is one of the things to do. Fight the friction and certainly look to not having excessive friction or any place where it's binding. I mean, it's not like that's great with any other thread, but you're going to find it much more likely to happen in somewhere in your thread path with metallics than any other time. So as you're threading your metallic thread through your machine and you're pulling that thing, look for those excess places where there are friction and pay attention to it. Also, by the way, when we talk about digitizing, why do people sometimes pull down their density somewhat? Number one, because the thread that they think they can run in a place of a 40 weight is not always what it is. You go look at, let's say, I often pick on Madeira because it's the brand that I'm most familiar with, but there's all sorts of awesome metallic threads out there. So whatever thread you're looking for, check out your vendor site and see what they recommend. But if you look at Madeira's site, when they talk about densities and needles and recommendations, their classic FS line of metallics, it's the 50 weight, the FS 50 that stands in for 40 weight standard thread that they recommend can be run just like a 40 weight. So if you're going with thicker thread or you're looking at it thinking that, let's say a metallic is listed as a 40 weight thread and you're trying to put it in the place that you would have a 40 weight standard thread, you may end up where it runs thicker than that. And it's not something that can pass through that same needle that can work in the same fashion, or they can use the same densities and have a result that you're happy with. So work on that. I would say that's something to think about. Fight the friction. If you've got excessive friction, you certainly can think about needle selection. You can think about lubrication, but whatever it is, you need to check that thread path, keep the thread path clean, make sure there is nowhere where we're getting excessive friction or binding so that we have that kind of on and off stuttering kind of binding. If you ever had trouble with like a binding around the bottom of a cone or somewhere else where there's something rough in your thread path, that will be twice as bad, 10 times as bad when you're running a metallic than running a standard polyester. It's definitely going to snag and break much more often, especially with that stuff. And by the way, Terry says, have you ever used glow-in-the-dark thread? Yes, and we'll talk about that. Actually, glow-in-the-dark is part of what I'm going to talk about for sure. And we have another comment from Bevy Jean. She says, I used to love using the top stitching on my home machine. Friction's good, but threading the needles are awesome too. Haven't found them. Totally RO and needles, though. I don't know exactly all that, but haven't found them in your needles, though, as you would want to. Like I said, there are different needle geometries you can use. You can actually talk to companies who make needles, too. They tend to give you recommendations about those geometries. You can get larger eye needles, certainly. Like I said, when I see people who are familiar with it, it's usually in the home market where they're very familiar with using top stitch needles or needles that are literally marketed as metallic needles. Whereas back in the day when I was talking to most of my commercial folks, they weren't as clear on that. And certainly I know people who I knew in embroidery who didn't have any concept of the density and thickness of the metallics changing. So that's one of those things. And definitely it's about thread path as well. So and now I'm going to talk about that in a second. So we have a few different steps I'm going to talk about. Certainly tension control. I always say tight tension control. Why do I say that? Not because I'm saying tighten your tension. In fact, it's loosening your tension, but it is actually keeping the tension. What you're going to find is I do use a lot of alliteration here. We use the F's here, fight the friction, tight tension control. It helps people remember stuff. That's all that is. But tension control in this case, because they may have more friction depending on the kind of thread you're using, the ones that have that kind of heavy texture, they will tend to have more tension on them even without altering anything on the machine, especially you got the classic tension discs and you wrap that same thread and it's wrapped around and touching itself and inside of the disc and it is rougher than the other thread you're using. It's going to slow that down. It's going to increase the tension on that thread and you may see some misbehavior. You may see it misbehaving and looping and causing other issues because your top tension is going to be too tight. So you may need to loosen your tension and you might need to check on that as far as the metallics. Plus, I find that a lot of the metallics are stretchier and suffer from more lashing and rebound. So check your tension and make sure that it's sensible. I mean, it's not just the friction because you're binding. You also have some issues, like I said, with tension based on that. And I'm going to go get to a comment here in a moment. I say keep away kinks, depending on your thread path and actually depending on how the thread is put up. You'll find that as it comes off of the spool, you'll have issues with kinks or twists. It'll twist back on itself. Everyone has seen a span of metallic thread where, due to the foil, the way it's built and the way that it's coming off of the spool or the cone that you're using, it'll twist back on itself, and then a loop will form somewhere in your thread path. And unless it twists itself back out, unless you can fight that kinking and twisting, you're going to end up with that getting to your tension wheels, getting to the needle, getting to somewhere in the thread path where it can't pass nicely, and it will break or hang up or cause some other issues. And in fact, what we have here is Jenny says, I find it eases the path if I take the spool off the holder and have it sit beside the machine. I made a pigtail to sit on the original holder to feed the thread through. I'm also going to tell you, especially in the home market side of this, there are multiple specialty metallic thread holders that spool the thread off differently. It really depends on what you're using. And for multi-needle machines, for commercial machines, generally our thread paths are farther away. I've found that sometimes hanging something on the thread, I know this sounds crazy. We used to use a large paper clip, like an oversized paper clip or a weight. I've seen people who will pass the thread through a styrofoam peanut, through something else that restricts the thread. Now that's more friction, and I don't love that concept. And in fact, there's a little more friction and tension going to be added by hanging something in the thread path. But doing something to move the thread path and allow it to come off of the spool in a way that's nice will help. The other thing is, there are some times where somebody will want to use a small amount of metallic or specialty thread, and so they have smaller cones, smaller, or even spools, the little finger spools. And I actually can show you what I'm talking about here. I have some of these photos here, and it's from a project I was working on where I was required or asked to use specialty threads, and I was looking at these threads and taking pictures of them. And let me just bring this up on screen for you. When you're using these little spools, these tiny finger spools that you'll see in craft stores, things like that, if you put them on a regular thread stand for a multi-needle machine and they're trying to come off vertically, as it comes off vertically, we get a coil. It's making this tight coil as it goes up, and it's just going to continue to wind off of that thing and cause that twisting and kinking that can cause issues in your thread path. So some people will then put this on a pencil on top of a mug, or they will go buy a specific thread holder that will hold these small spools in a horizontal fashion so the thread will spool off of it in a horizontal way and come off straight rather than coming off of the end where it's coiling up. On a traditional cone, it is meant to come off of the end like that. People certainly, you look at a home embroidery machine, they often pull that thread off of the end. You'll find that these threads tend to keep that coil. They have more memory of being wound tighter. And for me, the tighter that they are wound, the more trouble I've had with kinking and misbehavior as far as these things locking up, binding up somewhere, twisting in on themselves when they're over a long span on the thread path. The number of kind of home solutions for this, or I almost call it's like folk medicine for embroidery. The number of solutions I've seen for this that are about, running it through something, having an extra thread path, having it way away from your machine so we have a long span that has some weight on it. There are multiple solutions to this. The thing to realize is as the thread comes off of that spool, they don't all come off of the same way. They're not all wound the same way, and they have a tendency sometimes to wind back on themselves. Whatever we can do to keep that from happening will help you get less thread breaks from those kinks and those loops traveling up into the thread path, into the head, and causing those breaks. So it depends. The other thing I've seen that is probably the easiest, and it's actually something Frank just said, and I'm going to go ahead and say that. Frank says, I use a thread net. It seems to help with twists. And I'm going to say, yeah, no, thread nets also help with that. A thread net on a cone, it just helps it come off in a logical way. And it doesn't, sometimes we get up to the top of the cone and you'll see that a ring of thread will pop right off the end as we get up to the top of the way it's wound. And we'll have that create one of those loops. So thread nets are another way to maintain the thread coming off in a predictable fashion, in a controllable fashion off the top of the metallic thread. And Cindy, we're going to talk about this in just a second, the selection of thread, and I'll actually go ahead and get into that. We talked about tension control. We talked about keeping away the kinks. Let's go ahead through the last couple of steps, and then I'll tell you the last thing about threads. Next one is slow the stitching. If you're having trouble with any of these things, I find that the faster we run, the more trouble we get into, either from pulling the thread off of the spool in a strange way or having issues with friction or kinks. If you have a thread that just won't behave. Now, by the way, the last step of this is about which thread you're using, but slow up your stitching a little bit. Don't run full bore. Don't run 1,200 stitches a minute just because you can. Sometimes you're not allowing the thread to relax. You're also not allowing the thread to rebound after it forms that stitch and settle. And the more we do that, we're adding a lot of strain and stress to the process as it's stretching, and especially the more speed we use. This is the same with polyester and everything else. We're getting more stretch, we're getting more lash, we're getting more rebound. It's not that we have to run at a snail's pace for everything. However, if you have a thread that you must use that is causing these problems, slowing it down can often help. Certainly running, hell-bent for leather is not always the way to get this stuff done, because we're going to end up with more thread breaks, and overall you're going to have a slower run because of all the trouble you have to fix. But that's one of the things. You can slow the stitching down. That can sometimes help. But this is the thing that I need to talk about now. Find a favorite thread. What does this mean? Run threads that run well. There are threads that run differently, and not always just ones that are made specifically in a different way that's more expensive, what have you, but different metallic threads really do behave differently. There is no question about this. The constructions can be different, and especially the more modern threads. We talked about Madeira CR earlier. Some people have told me their favorite is Glisten, which is also a very similar thread in that it is coated. It has a coating, and it's processed differently. These threads are made to run like normal thread, like polyester thread. Cindy says this, and I've actually heard this a couple times. I cannot verify because this is not a thread brand I've used, but she said, I love metallics. I use in the home embroidery world to use Kingstar. You can just use your regular needles and then speed stays the same. And so that's what she's saying. Kingstar for her worked well. I've heard that sometimes. It has not been something I've tested myself. Mostly, I actually haven't had much trouble with traditional like Madeira FS. I did well with those. I did have some trouble with some of the stuff from Gunold, but I haven't used a ton of it. And I'm also going to admit this. The reason I talk about cone sizes and put-ups is that often the work I was doing was specialty work where I am throwing on a small number of garments onto a commercial machine that is set up for running polyester, for running quickly and running polyester. And I'm throwing on a mini cone or something small, a mini king, some people call them those snap cones, something like that. And if you just throw on a little tiny one that tends to have that tendency, or a little spool like I showed you in that earlier image, and I can throw that back up again. You throw one of those up on your standard commercial machine with no other setup done on it or anything to mitigate problems, and you're going to find all this kink and spooling and issues going on much more than anything. And actually, if you look at the piece that I'm showing here, some of the stuff that I've been called on to use, like the hollow films, they're even more likely. They have really wide, almost tape-like films that you can see with the naked eye, no problem. And also some of the threads I've used that were very difficult for me, at least, in this configuration on those machines were the monofilament glow, where it's almost like a thin fishing line. It is not a twisted thread. The kind of glow we have now that looks like standard threads but has a glow to it is a world apart from the monofilament glow threads that I was using earlier on in my career. And those ran also poorly. They had a tendency to snap more easily, had problems with those sorts of things as well. And like I said, what I'm going to say about this though, is that everybody has a favorite. And I'm going to be honest and say that I cannot say for sure scientifically that it makes any sense to me. Because I have had everybody, if we get into this right now, if I just tell everybody, bomb the comments with your favorite thread, we're already hearing, like Jenny said, I hear Kingstar being raved about, but I don't get on with it. I use Isomet, and that's the thing. It just depends, right? It really just depends. Works for her. And I'd say, yeah, I've had okay times with Isomet, but I've also had no problem with, in fact, I found the Madeira FS ran very well for me without a lot of help. However, I ran FS50. So I ran a thinner metallic, and I'm going to be honest with that. I tend to find that I like the way the thinner metallics run, and I can do some kind of cool stuff with them. I can get some very fine renderings, and I'm actually going to show you some stuff that I ran with that real quick. I've got a piece that I think you may have seen before, and this is, this was kind of under kind of not the best lighting conditions, but you can see I'm getting pretty nice small detail with that FS50, and I really didn't have to do much to make that happen. Nice small text, nice small detail. decent formation. I can definitely see, you'll see these little highlights that are inside of the satin stitch, and that's that kinking I told you about, where it tends, if you look really closely, if you look under a microscope with this stuff or under magnification, you'll see that where you expect there to be a rounded loop of thread, you'll sometimes see a sharp kink in the thread. And I think that really is about the construction of the thread and the foils. But that FS50 for me ran great. I didn't really have a lot of trouble with that. And a lot of my favorite pieces I've done in metallic have been run with that FS50. However, we're talking about finding your favorite thread. This image was actually to show you the difference between two threads that I have seen commonly. So on the left, actually, I believe that might be Monrex. I can't remember. It's a classic metallic. If you see, it is very, very shiny. It has an extremely high shine, a lot of sparkle, a lot of highlight to it. On the right-hand side is Madeira CR. The Madeira CR, though, that stuff is coated. It is smoother. It is softer. It also feels softer to the touch if that's the thing that you want for your particular garment. And that CR you can run at speed, standard needle setup, standard everything. For me, I had no problem with it. And I've been able to slap it in with no changes depending on, there's nothing that I had to do to my design or to my setup to make it run. Why do I tell you all this specialty stuff you can do to make a thread that's rough run? Well, because sometimes there are threads in colors or in styles or that look in a certain way that must be run, that you have a company who says, I want that color to absolutely match what we've been doing forever. I have a particular thread I want to use, or you just really love a particular color or style of thread. When you have to run that stuff and you're having these issues, there are ways you can mitigate the problems. If I am right now starting a brand new shop that's going to be doing metallic work on the regular, I'm probably looking at speccing out thread like the CR to say, all right, this runs fairly reliably and I don't have to do anything to it when I throw it on the machine. I can pull another thread cone off of the machine, put this thread on and run, and I'm not going to have that much trouble. So for me, I'm thinking production-wise, I'm thinking in a commercial sphere, that production might be worth it to me to spend that money. It might not be to you. Or you might find that you find another less expensive thread. Like I said, some people swear by glisten. I haven't had a good time with it, but I've only tested it off of smaller cones. So I know that for me, it might also be a setup or a thread path problem that I had. This sort of coated metallic has run very well for me. So the coated metallics like the CR, I find have run very well for me. They might not be for everybody, but like I said, I think they're pretty interesting. And that's something that really depends on what you're doing. It's really something that you have to kind of go on a cost benefit analysis for yourself and see what you like and what you don't like, what you think is valuable to you. But when you're looking through all these metallic threads, like I said, people have different ways they handle them, but it really comes down to selections. Like I said, always look and see what people recommend who make the thread. They're not in the business of trying to trick you into buying the different kinds of needle for them. Whatever needle you buy, if you're buying it from them, is great. But they're going to say things like, they're going to tell you, what density am I looking for your FS 50? What am I looking for 40? What am I looking for all these different sizes? And what sort of needles am I expecting to use? And, in this case, we can see that we have different sorts of recommendations from the companies. This is actually a sheet from Madeira where they have a stitch density guide. And whenever we look at the different metallics, you can see they'll actually give you a list and say, these are the weights that we're looking at. This is what we expect to see. We expect you to do and what we should expect you to run for your densities, right? And that's the kind of thing. They'll talk about your recommended needle. And you'll see once you get down to like the 35 weight, they're really looking for you to run that 90-14 needle. They want a bigger needle for that. I would say if you're having problems with tension, running a slightly larger needle, for sure is going to help. I find that that's an issue when you're having more friction. However, most of the time I'm selecting a metallic that's going to work the best for me and that I don't have to reformat my machine, but my mind is still in the production space. If I was doing something in a boutique space, I would start saying, okay, hey, if they want some sort of crazy reflective film, they want something different, they want hollow shimmer, they want something like that, and I can charge for it, I'm all about throwing a specialty needle on, slowing down the machine and making it run, because I have a higher priced item. If I were doing bridal work right now and somebody wanted, ivory hollow shimmer, boy, I'm going to figure that out. I'm going to find that out because I know that my margins per piece are going to be a lot higher there than if I'm doing a load of golf polos for maybe a high-end place. But at the same time, I have to keep it within the realm of normal garment decoration. Well, then I'm going to be looking at efficiency, how many thread breaks are likely to happen, how much work I have to do when I'm rethreading. Am I changing tensions on my machines? Am I putting new needles in? or a different kind of needle on every head of my multi-head machine or multiple multi-head machines. Now I have to think about that as an efficiency matter. But like I said, go look at the stuff that's there. When you look at what's there, classic FS is what Madeira usually uses. Like I said, I'm not sponsored by Madeira, but I know their stuff really well, so I tend to talk about it. Also used to use Isomet, also used, hey, like I said, all sorts of metallics that are out there. While Iris Metallic from Enmart, I've used a ton of them for different reasons. And honestly, a lot of them for me used to be color selection, but now color selection's all over the place. But this is the FS from Madeira. Then we can start see the CR. And the interesting thing about the CR, like I said, it has that color coating that's on it. It's resistant against abrasion, optimized to just be thrown in to stitch at speed. That's really what it's for. It's meant to be stitched at speed, and that's really the thing. However, the trade-off, like I said earlier, the trade-off with CR is the CR, to my eye, little duller, doesn't have quite the specular kind of highlights. It doesn't have that shine, that really hot highlight as much as the classic metallic, and it is a little more expensive. And maybe not a little, it's fairly more expensive than a traditional metallic. So what I would say, and I agree with Jeff. Jeff has a good point here, and I totally agree. Try everything and find out what works best for you. You will find your machine setup, the way you run, the way you like to run, the materials also that you work on. The garment you work on can make a difference here. If you're running through something super heavy that causes more abrasion, a metallic's going to have trouble with the garment. You're running through Carhartt, it's going to be different than you're running through cashmere sweaters. It's going to be a different sort of full setup, and it may have differences as far as the way these things run. Yeah, like I said, Jeff said it right. Try everything you like, find what works best for you. I'm going to be honest with you. Every time I've had this discussion, 10 people will come out and say, I like this one, and this is why. Someone else will come back to them and say, I don't like that one, never worked. My machine doesn't like it, is always what I hear. And this one did work for me. The truth of the matter is there's multiple things that go into that, and it's not quite as simple, but trying what you have available to you is a great way to handle it. So we've gone pretty long on metallic thread. We're going to talk about a few more things kind of briefly, but I think it's interesting to at least get to some of the other things there that we can do as far as shiny things. One of the things that's really interesting lately is the rise of reflective threads. And in this case, I'm not talking about shiny threads. I'm actually talking about retro reflective. Now, retro reflective is a different kind of thing. I'm going to see if I can try to show you some stuff about that. What we've seen lately, if you're looking at, it depends on who you're looking at. Madeira is their latest one is called Reflect. We've seen a lot of them though. If you look for, pardon me, we've got A&E. This is one of the first ones I ever saw. This Anaphyl Reflector is another one. Sulky has Reflex Cry right here. And actually it looks like turn that off. All right. So let's see what we got here. We have all these different retro reflective threads, and I'm going to talk about it again. Madeira has the Reflect that came out fairly recently. If you look at other reflective materials, and I'm going to talk about other stuff there, but A&E has Anaphyl, which is one of the first ones I ever saw. Sulky has Reflex. So there's multiple people who have these reflective threads. The thing is, when we're talking about retro reflective stuff and we're talking about true reflective thread like this, where you're seeing a flash, where if we're looking at the reflection, we have this silver color under normal light, but when direct light is applied to it, we're getting this absolute reflection back to us, this super hot highlight. These are retro reflective, and retro reflective is kind of exactly what it sounds like. Retro reflective material sends the light back to the direction of the light coming in. Like the light comes in and it sends it back that same direction back out. Usually you're thinking about reflective, it's coming in at an angle, and then the angle that it comes back out is opposing that, right? We have that complementary angle, it goes back out the other direction from where it's going. Light comes in this way, goes back out at the opposite angle. Retroreflective, the light comes in and it goes right back toward the source that it comes to, and it requires different materials. It's not just shiny. It actually has reflective layers inside of it that change this. And in fact, what we're seeing, especially with the thread at least, there's different things that can happen with this. These days we have prisms as well as the classic thing, which is glass beads over foil. There will be a foil and glass beads that act essentially as little spherical lenses. And I believe I've got an image to show you guys here. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can show you an image of what we're talking about. I'll go ahead and bring this up real quickly. This is kind of what we're talking about. So the glass beads over foil is what we're seeing up here. The light hits the glass bead. It acts like a little spherical lens. It focuses down onto this reflector down here, this reflector coating that's behind it, and then the light comes back out of that lens, like I said, going back roughly toward the source of the light. So like I said, if we're coming towards something with our headlights, we are with the light source, we are looking in the same direction the light source is coming in. Well, that light is hitting that glass bead. It's reflecting down to the foil layer. The reflective layer is then kicking that light back out toward us. What's also done now in larger retroreflective materials, not in thread, are these prisms, these micro prisms, just like you would think, if you think of a classic bike reflector with all the little prismatic shapes inside of it, that's something that's kind of the same thing. The top film comes down, it hits these micro prisms, and it goes back out. It's a similar thing, but not quite the same. What's happening essentially with our threads is we're having this glass beads over foil, but in thread form. We actually have foils that are built into our threads, that are wrapped into our threads. There are yarns that actually have these glass beads and that foil inside of them. So if you're wondering, why is this so expensive? Well, we're not just pulling a bunch of fibers together when we're doing this stuff. We actually have, in retroreflective materials, we actually have that much structures going inside of there. There are actual glass beads inside there that are inside of that foil layer that are there to cause that retroreflective effect to happen. So yes, it is a different technology. It is not just shiny. It's not just metallic. It is there are little tiny lenses that are grabbing that light and kicking it back out in the direction it came from. So there is that glass bead over foil construction inside of the thread. So when we're saying it's expensive, we should realize like this is a fairly technical thing that we're getting this material. Though I do like the comment that we have from Jenny. She says, as you say, they're more expensive, but most of the time it's an accent. So the price change is minimal in the grand scheme of things. And here's what I'll say is I would not seek myself to use this to create a fully, like a safety garment. I never heard other people say this as well. Certainly, I know Nancy Minnie of Madeira was talking about this recently when she was discussing the reflective threads. And I'm going to say, truthfully, they are harder to run. I've found that people have had thread break issues with them. When you look at the recommendations online, they say they run like other thread. I am going to say that people have told me who run it more often than I do, that it is a little more difficult to run, and they've had to slow down their machines and be a little more careful about density and friction, things like that as well. Very much like old school metallics. But I like the idea that Jenny has of using it as an accent. And certainly one of the things that I've recommended when I've helped people work with the reflective is, number one, use it as an accent. If you're actually trying to make a reflective garment that's a safety garment, the way to handle a reflective safety garment is to have like classic foils, films, and tapes. I mean, what you're looking for with safety clothing, really, it shouldn't be just these little tiny accent marks. You should have full tapes. You should have applied materials. And there's all sorts, those are luminous materials, but reflective fabrics often come in setups like this. I know that the shop that I was in, we used to convert garments to have full safety reflective strips on them, and they come with sometimes with these pre-bound strips where we have essentially a fluorescent material that has a retroreflective strip on it, and it has to be stitched on. There are also heat applied films, and we can even use those heat applied films in our embroidery. So you don't just have to use retroreflective thread to make this happen. But let's say we're trying to make something actually safety material, then we're looking at trying to have retroreflective materials like these tapes, like full films or applied materials like this. So we can do different retroreflective materials to make this happen. But the true tape strips and stuff like that, I would really much prefer to see people using those when you're talking about making safety apparel, because safety apparel, also there are regulations to safety apparel depending on where you're at and what it's for. But the high vis stuff, we're doing that. When we're using the thread, if we already have a high vis vest like this and we want to add a logo or a logo type or monogram or lettering for a company, having a small single color design that has the retroreflective material in it can be a really cool way to highlight it. The other cool thing you can do is use a portion of the reflective. I've actually helped people to make blended fills where they have maybe 50% or even 50% or less sometimes of reflective in the fill, or they use a reflective border around an otherwise filled element. So in the light, we have a silver element that's entirely filled and has a silver border that's on it. But then when we are in the dark or get that direct flash that direct flash or directed light on the garment. The border around the letter, some element in the logo is now reflective, but not the entire thing, thereby having us use less. And like I said earlier, for doing running garments, outerwear stuff for pets, sometimes a small logo on a cuff, a small logo on a strap or band, something on the yoke, something on the collar. These are awesome ways to use it as an accent. Very much the way, if you look at running gear, you look at apparel that is made for the commercial market, you'll often see these small strips, stripes, dots, small logos done rather than a full giant jacket back. You're doing that, and I think we're in the realm of using retroreflective materials or applique. And it really doesn't have to be difficult, even for people who don't cut. This is actually a piece, and I'm not going to play this video live necessarily. I'll probably scrub a little bit through it. This was done by Stalls. So this is Stalls using their 3M retroreflective material. And what you can see here, they've done a rip-away applique process. You ever heard me talk about this before? The rip-away applique process uses a heat material that's usually used for heat pressing, cut and press materials, and it uses it as an applique without having to pre-cut it. And what you're going to see is you take the material off of the carrier, and so you've got this stuff taken off of the clear carrier that it's usually on. And what you're going to see is that we're going to run, essentially, you'll see these borders that let you know where everything needs to be placed. This is where the lettering is going to be. We put the full sheet of reflective material over it, and then we're just going to be essentially stitching a full density satin border. Once the full density satin border is stitched down, it is perforated. And the great thing we can do then is we're just tearing away that material. And we have now reflective applique material. This is the heat applied film. So this is not the kind that you'd have to sew or cut. Certainly we could use a retroreflective material like the Scotch Slate that has to be cut, that's actually embedded in a proper fabric. But in this case, we're using heat press material. Once we tear that all away, we would just be heat pressing this. And once it's heat pressed, it's fully sealed down to the garment. And now we have a retroreflective garment with not too many stitches. So yeah, thank you to the people from Stalls for sharing that, Stalls TV. But you can see there are ways we can add retroreflective materials to a larger area without resorting to using really expensive thread. I mean, the technology used to make the thread and the thread itself, of course, is going to make it sometimes prohibitively expensive for a big jacket back. Hey, if your customer wants to pay for it, be upfront with them and tell them what this stuff costs and that it's not something that you're just going to be able to do for the same price as standard embroidery. However, there are other options using heat applied materials or other things like that. And honestly, I think you could even get away with doing something almost like the Mylar process, something like this. If you wanted to add some texture or do something interesting and it's decorative, not necessarily, like I said, not necessarily going to be used for something like on a construction site where we're using it for safety. But in any case, large areas where we're covering that large area, we want a reflective piece in it. I have actually done this honestly, in a decorative sense. I made something that's interesting. We're talking about Halloween coming up, spooky season. I made some retroreflective patches in that same fashion where, though, yes, the outside of it is a solid satin border, I did some light filling. And the thing that I did was essentially a single color skull design, but it had shading in it. It had the eyes were entirely stitched over in full embroidery. It had some shading, so light density fills to shade and have some of the reflectivity, but not all of it. But the base background of the skull was entirely the reflective patch. So you can sew on the top of this material still and have some of that detail done. Just remember, whenever you have a full cut edge, if you start pulling on that material before it's heat sealed down, just the same way it ripped around the edge, if you've got full satin details on the inside of, let's say, a patch like I did, or an applique like I'm talking about, these skull appliques that I did, if you pull on that material or strain or stress that material against one of those full satin coverage borders or details, you can still tear it and have that material tear away early or in a place that you don't want it to tear. So when we're doing rip-away applique, we've got to be careful about that. Certainly I could have used fully reflective material and pre-cut and then use that for applique or for patches. And like I said, one of the cool things we can do is use shading or color over the top of it and allow for that material to show through using very light densities. And we can still have a little bit of color in the daytime and then still get that retro reflective activity for nighttime. But like I said, don't cover too much of it, or there's really no point to it. It has to have light hit it for it to reflect and be useful to you. Like I said, that retro reflective materials are interesting now. When we deal with this kind of stuff, I always, like I said, we talk about the cost of it. We talk about what we can use it for. I really do agree with Jenny in the fact that I think that it's great to have it as an accent, but maybe not as a primary thing. But you're going to find it from multiple folks who have released this now. Like I said, Madeira is the one that I know very well, and they have their reflect. And as you can see under that reflected light, how bright that is. But it does not approach the full clear brightness of, like I say, an applied material and applied film. They are not quite as bright. Those certainly, if you look at, like we said before, this anaphylla, we have that sulky. That is an interesting amount of reflectivity. You are certainly getting that retroreflective effect, and it is silver in the daytime. It is really retroreflective, so it is not just shiny. It's not just silver thread. It is very much actually using those spherical lenses to reflect that off of the film. So like I said, multiple people are making that. Coates has Signal. There's all these different ways it's being used, but it absolutely is something that's going to cost you more, and you may want to look at it as an accent. So another way that we can use that stuff, I think it's interesting. It's something that is worth mentioning. Retroreflective materials, reflective threads, really cool stuff, but definitely take a look at other reflective materials, both in the fact that you can get those pre-made tapes or heat seal materials that are great to put on for actual reflective stripes on safety garments, and the fact that if you want to do something interesting, hey, you're making your Halloween costume that you want your kiddo to have some reflective stuff for walking around at night, or if you're making some stuff for pets and you want it to be reflective when you're walking around in the morning, large areas of retroreflective material may still make more sense to use heat press materials or other materials as applique. But yeah, interesting stuff. I think it's pretty cool. Just really depends on how you want to handle it and how much cost you want to put into it. I still love the reflective thread because it's unexpected. When someone has like a small logo bug on something and someone notices that it has that reflective tendency toward it, I think that is one of those value adds, and it adds delight. One of the places I saw recently, very recently, I had gone to Shirt Lab. You guys know I was a speaker at Shirt Lab in Fort Worth pretty recently, and the guys at Shirt Lab made some merch, and they had awesome Champion backpacks. And I'll show you one of these if I don't remember. I don't have it with me today, but they had some Champion backpacks for the attendees and the speakers. And on these Champion backpacks, they had they have like a symbol that looks like a little atom that's part of the Shirt Lab logo, and they had just that little atom symbol at the top center of the bag pocket, of the main pocket of the bag. So it's just this little tiny piece, and they didn't get to do it with all of them, but they had some that were done with the retro reflective threads. And that retro reflective thread, when you're carrying that backpack, it really does shine out when you're, walking around with that thing. So that little retro reflective bug, it's just an added little bit of value, and it adds something that's interesting and novel. And I can absolutely see doing that. Like I said, sleeve, back yoke, collar, something like that, hemline, doing a cool little detail design, a portion of your logo, an element from a logo as an accent is a really cool way to handle that. And like I said, and like Jenny said, more cost effective than doing large pieces. And so to talk about something else that's a little different for me, let's go ahead and do just a quick run on glow in the dark. Very quickly, I'm just going to say glow in the dark these days is a much better run than you might expect back in the day, the way I used to run it. If we go back to some of these other things, this is the stuff I've been running lately. For me in Madeira Luna, there's tons of these now. The thing that I'm going to say is just this. The thread now, it looks like thread. It runs like thread. You don't have to torture yourself with it so much. When I was first doing glow in the dark, it was very much like fishing line. It was monofilament, and it didn't run very well. The current glow in the dark threads, you shouldn't be afraid of. If you're someone who's been in the industry for a really long time and you have run away from the glow in the dark stuff because you don't like it, by all means, go back to it, try it again. I think it's cool. What I will say is it never photographs as well as you would like it to. No matter which photograph of glow in the dark you see, it always looks a little rougher, a little duller than it looks like in real life. For some reason, the camera just can't do it justice. So what I'm going to tell you is if you're going to sell glow in the dark, don't feel bad about adjusting your levels a little bit. I'm not saying lie and change the levels on the image to the point where it looks like a beacon shining out that you can see it from space. But if it looks a little off, don't feel bad about adjusting the levels. Because you look at this piece here, this is an Aegis Hjalmar. It's kind of a late, it's really a medieval. It's not Viking Age. Everybody thinks it's Viking Age. It's not exactly Viking Age. The piece is from a manuscript, a later manuscript from Iceland, a magical symbol. And the Aegis Hjalmar here, I did this in glow in the dark thread. up on the up on the top. You can see it in the daylight, but on the bottom you see it in the dark. And this looks pretty good, and it still doesn't look awesome. It looks a little dull. There are areas that don't look very shiny. But when I was looking at this thing in my hand in the dark, it looked incredible, right? I mean, it looked awesome. And by the way, glowing runes on an object at night, boy, it looks pretty cool. Glowing magical symbols, I'm all about it. That looks fun. But the photographing didn't look awesome. And if I were to sell this piece, I would absolutely think about playing with that exposure or playing with my final image and giving it more of the sense of what it looks like to me in real life, because the camera never picks up that light the way your eye does. It just does not adjust the way that our eyes do. I think it is totally fair to go into your favorite photograph editing software and push up the contrast a little bit, give it a little more highlight. You shouldn't feel like you're faking it. I mean, like I said, don't make it look like a glowing beacon in the night, but do push that up a little bit if you're selling this stuff online, because the truth of the matter is, as long as you're absolutely not cheating, you don't have a glow-in-the-dark thread that just doesn't shine at all. Be honest about what it takes to charge it. Be honest about how bright it is. However, it just doesn't photograph the best. Every time I've had to photograph it, I've been just miserable with how it turned out. In this case, it didn't look too bad, but some of them just look pretty rough. The other great thing, I saw some pieces that Lisa did recently. I'm going to bring these up again later because these are pieces that I'm talking about with that Mylar, but this is her piece recently, and this was done with I believe her thread might have been from Metler. I don't know their brand name for it. If she's around, or if any of you use the Metler threads that she does, please feel free to put the brand name in here. Like I said, this is not sponsored by name particularly. I'm showing you the Madeira Luna because it's what I have. But this glow in the dark she used really came out nice and bright. I was actually fairly impressed. It photographed pretty well, but you can still see where there's you're not seeing a tremendous amount of texture in these length limit or auto split style satins that are up here in the ears of the little cat patch I made. She stitched this out, but I digitized the cat, so anything that's wrong with it, you can blame me for. But she stitched this little cat out, and hers is this boo design that she did here. You can see certainly when there's multiple layers laid out that there are bright spots in it. But I'm going to say overall, very happy with how the more modern stuff turned out. Even the piece that I showed you earlier, that AG Schellenmeyer, that is a slightly older thread. It is not the kind of thread that we have now. This is a more modern glow in the dark. They glow brighter. They run better. Technology has just come along, I think, as far as glow in the dark threads. And by the way, though, I'm going to talk about this again later. If you guys want this, I will go ahead and throw this link up for everybody. I think I'll put this in the comments. I did not put this on the links list yet. I can put it over there. These are actually free designs that you can go get from the Brilliance website. So if you like the little cat design with this, and you can replace names in the piece if you want to, it'll only be the fonts that you have for Brilliance, but they're there. These patches are all available from there, and you can check those out if you want to. I'll go ahead and throw that in the comments now. But yeah, this glow in the dark thread that she elected to use for this stuff, I think it photographed pretty well, but you can see that there's this darkness in it. And also, if I was trying to show the glow in the dark in the patch, I probably would mess with this photo more and have some additional kind of a little bit of additional clarity to it if I was selling this thing online as a patch I wanted everybody to buy. I'd say, honestly, the modern thread doesn't need it like the old patches used to. The old material used to, these patches look a lot better than the old school glow in the darks I used to use did. These look much better. And like I said, they run much better. I just haven't had the trouble running these modern threads that look like thread, that are spun like thread, that aren't the monofilament line that I used to have to use. So that is, like I said, glow in the dark thread. I don't have a ton to tell you about it aside from it's another thing where you can use it as an accent. In this case, she actually used it for quite a lot. Most of this boo here has done that glow in the dark thread as well. But one of the cool things I've seen done with glow in the dark that I just like as a concept, and it's something that for me, I love the concept of delighting somebody with something unexpected. One of the things I've seen that's very awesome is to hide things in a similar color of non-glowing thread. So let's say we have a circle or some object that's filled with one color of thread that is non-glowing, but then we hide a crescent moon inside of it in glowing thread. You can look, if you look carefully, you can see it, but at night, a new revealed thing comes out. That is super cool. I love the concept of that. Or maybe just the eyes on a creature, just something, one element being glow in the dark out of the piece, or you're hiding it in a field of color that you can't see it in, especially the glow in the darks that tend to run and look fairly white in the daytime. throwing those in a field of white thread, otherwise used for something else, or where we don't have a lot of contrast, but suddenly at night, these secret things get revealed. I think that is such a cool feature, and it's so fun that it's something that I would see as a marketing ploy to play with this stuff. Like I said, neither here nor there. It's a design consideration. You don't have to worry too much about specialty digitizing for this stuff, but do let yourself think, what could I do with glow in the dark thread that I couldn't do any other way? And I love that. I mean, like I said, any of these features, and metallic thread's kind of that way too. The things we should think about when we're using this stuff, whether it's retroreflective does the same thing. It is kind of low key. It looks gray often or silver. It doesn't really look all that bright or interesting in the daytime, but as soon as it gets that light that hits it, it is incredible. It is something that people don't expect. That is one of those things that can create delight, and that delight, that novelty, increases people's perceived value for your product. So whatever you're talking about, any of these specialty threads, any of these special techniques, in fact, looking at what that can do that isn't done anywhere else or isn't done in any other way is a way we can say, what's unique I can do with this? What can I use to drive that kind of value? And to my mind, anytime we can have something where there's a reveal, where there's something you might not expect, or where there's additional functionality that wasn't necessarily expected or is added aside from or on top of the decorative value, the promotional value, the marketing value, the recognition value that is in part and parcel of the nature of embroidery, and especially commercial embroidery, we're talking about recognition and promotion. If we can add something else that is interesting, that is valuable, and that also can, like the retroreflective stuff, add a real tangible value like safety, like additional visibility, what have you, that is a way to really include and increase that value and that perception of value. That's really cool. So let's go ahead and grab a couple more comments as we're here. Jenny says, I stitch a design for a mushroom company in glow in the dark. They love it. I would bet, can you imagine if you have a company for whatever reason that has their employees in darkness for whatever reason that is, or let's say we have an employee that has their employees under black lights. Let's say that you have a company of people who run galactic bowling. I know this is a weird way to put it, but I'm trying to think of all the different people who might have black lights on them any number of times. Running glow in the dark thread or fluorescent threads is going to make their logo pop and be super cool, especially when it transitions. It has that reveal from normal light into the black light. Or in this case, you've got a company of people who may or may not have to enter darkened areas with regularity. Somebody who works in a cave, like somebody who's working in a mushroom company, who knows? That might be a thing. Who knows? I think it's interesting. The concept of someone who works in the dark, getting that glow in the dark. Now, glow in the dark, the charge does run out, but retro-reflective stuff like that's super cool. And Jenny says, we do it for a stage lighting company too. There's that thematic match. Remember how I talked about how shiny things are great for jewelers and people selling luxury cars and people doing polished stone for countertops? They like rhinestones. They like shiny because the thing they do is shiny, and shiny is part of the value. A stage lighting company does lighting. The concept of giving off light and having a glow in the dark thing is awesome. Plus, stage lighting, they're probably often under light where, yes, they're lighting something, but they're in the dark. They're off stage. They're working in the dark. And so they get that little pop of glow on their logo. That is just choice. That is just choice. You got to love that stuff. And I'm with Aaron. Love the glow in the dark in any media. I love it too. The folks at Embroidery Nerd, Jeff made cool little PVC patches that have what he calls the nerd star. It's a little star with nerd glasses on it, and that glows in the dark. And that is one of those things where people see that, they're like, oh, that's awesome. It glows in the dark. And everybody does the trick and they close something up and take a look at it. That's delight. Delight drives that feeling that they have with you. Your brand is, let me just put this out there. Your brand is not your logo and your motto and your colorway. It's not just that. Your brand is everything about the experience someone has with you or your products. And if people have delight, if they feel joy, if they have novelty that is interesting, if they have something cool to show someone else, and you're related to that, you have that delight, that joy, that positive feeling rub off on you and your product. This is part of it. Glow in the dark stuff, shiny stuff, stuff that's fun, stuff that has hidden features, stuff that is novel is going to feed into that. And lastly, let's go ahead and go to the last thing. Let's go to the Mylar really quickly. And this is something, like I said, another way to add sparkle, something that I really didn't do in the commercial world, something that wasn't part of my work. Now, I will say I definitely did layering of metallic threads, super twist, like I showed you before. And layering, when I'm talking about, when I think about Mylar, the only similar thing I did was I would do light metallic fills with other colors filled on top of them or into them, or I would even run metallic almost underlay and then have a lighter fill on top, and you get little sparkles. So I remember doing a piece for I believe it was a pool company. It was a pool or a pond or something. I'm trying to remember now, where we had a field of water, and in that water, I ran a very light metallic fill under the water, under the aqua color of the water, because it imparted just a little sparkle underneath the light fill on the top. So we had this light fill of the metallic underneath that also had the underlay in it. So we had like kind of the crisscross underlay under that light fill. And then on top of it, we filled in the rest of the density for coverage with the aqua color on top so that we had sparkle underneath the color. And I think Mylar has that same function, but I never really had that concept of using Mylar to do this. And certainly when I was doing it in commercial logos, it was still on a full coverage fill, or at least mostly full coverage, and didn't have entirely, open coverages. So we had a lot of sparkle. But Mylar is another way to think about that. Mylar is used as a film. Some people will know it as a gift wrap material. So we have, they're often pearlescent or opalescent Mylars. It's a plastic film. It's thin. They do tear pretty easily, but they're fairly tough, but they can tear, especially when perforated, and they do tear away when perforated. But Mylar is another way we can add some sparkle under light fills. The only thing to really think about with this, and first let me go ahead and show you guys, this is the thing that made me want to talk about it today. We had a little video that Lisa put together of that free patch kit that I showed you guys a minute ago, that little free patch setup. And I'll go ahead and throw this on screen for you. This is actually the video that Lisa put together. And what I love, you probably won't get a lot of this because of the resolution that's here. We'll go ahead and pull this out of there and just have me out of the way. But what you're going to see here is check out that sparkle. And really, it's a pretty standard patch setup. But if you look at it, the sparkle that's on it, and now we're into the glow stuff and everything else. I'll go back to the sparkle, but seeing the little bit of sparkle that's on there, that from what Lisa put together, you just have to love that, especially when all you really have to do to get that sparkle is to lay this stuff down under a light density fill. So it is a light density fill or a stippling fill with the Mylar laid down first. So we have a placement stitch, we lay down our Mylar, and then we fill over the top of it. And to me, I'm like, of all of the kind of low impact things we can do, that is an incredibly low impact process, because we're laying it down and then tearing away the edge once we're done with it. So, super simple way to handle it. We have a fill. Maybe we're going to go like 1.2 mils. So, 12 points, 1.2 mils, really light open fill, less than half density or more than, double that spacing that we usually would have for a standard full coverage fill on 40 weight thread. And we're just filling on top of it. And as you can see, though the Mylar she had was actually colored in an orange, something that worked with the actual pumpkin, you can also use other colors and allow the color of the thread to add most of the color to the design. But it's a great deal of color that's in here. And like I said, because it's an actual layer, because it actually has some thickness to it, I've seen some really cool kind of opalescent, translucent, strange effects that can go on with that light fill. And in fact, with the ornaments that Jim did, the Mylar was a lot of the body of these pieces. And so it really did have some light and translucency. It was interesting to see kind of reflections, because we had multiple swirling opalescent kind of colors in the Mylar. But the fun thing is that the color of the thread on top of it really does change the character. It makes your eye see this as an opalescent version of the top thread color. And it's really interesting. I think that there's just tricks that the eye does when it's blending these things together that are really interesting. So you can use different kinds of colors and different effects to make that happen. But really, when we're talking about Mylar, I think the most technical thing we're looking at is a light density fill or some stippling that goes over the top of it. And the stuff that really is worth mentioning about using something like Mylar, this is not going to respond really awesomely to heat, so we need to be careful with laundry. In talking to people about this before I did this, like I said, I'm going to be transparent that this is not something I have a tremendous amount of experience with, especially as it comes to using it for apparel. If we were doing this for apparel specifically, the way that I've heard it essentially recommended on this is that this has got to be treated like something that is fairly fragile. It has to be treated like a finer garment in that you want to wash it inside out, which, hey, honestly, most embroidery, rhinestone, stuff like that, you probably want to do that anyway. Inside out, line dry it. And if you're using any kind of heat on it, and most people said don't, but when I kind of did a survey of the people who talked about it, I heard some people say, oh yeah, you can. However, low heat on the iron, always with a press cloth or pressed from the back and still with a press cloth. Don't put any direct heat on it. And nobody said throw this thing and treat it like normal material. And like I said, it depends on who you are and how you've used it. Definitely want to find people to discuss that if you have more experience with it. But this is what I've heard. I would be most concerned with this on apparel as a function of what happens in the laundry. So inside out, line dry, press cloth. This is another good reason for you to make up some directions that go with garments. And actually, I've said this to people in general. No matter what you're using, I think laundry instructions are fantastic to include. Plus, it's another place where you can brand. So branded laundry instructions, whether this is done through a hang tag where you're actually tagging a garment. You ever seen the tags that have the little plastic hanger? If you're not someone who's, in the market of using tags like that, you little hang tagging gun, you throw it through the needle, you pop it in there, and you have this little tag that hangs off of it. Custom tags are not supremely expensive. I love those where you put your decoration company, whatever it is, you put your name on it, or if it's something you're doing as your own line, your line name, whatever your company name is on it, your logo on it, and on the back you got laundry instructions and contact information. So what does that give you? You can tell your customer how to care for a garment so they know what they need to do to make sure that garment is maintained and works well over time and does not die on you and keeps the decoration looking the way it should. And you get an extra chance to brand, to show you care about them, to give them contact information for reordering, whatever it is. And also one of the things you can do with hang tags like that is awesome. I also love the concept of the sticker hang tag. There are some folks who like to do a sticker hang tag. You can have these made where there's a die cut sticker or a sticker layer you can pull off, and they can have a branded sticker with your information, your company logo on it as part of the hang tag. It's a cool, and depending on what kind of line you're using, it might even become collectible. If it's something where the art on the sticker is related to the art on the garment, especially if you're doing your own line of branded garments or branded accessories that have images that are designed for it, it's not just your company logo, then those can be part of the value added package as well. So cool things to do. Laundry instructions, even if you're just throwing a sheet in the box, I think it's a great way to have one more point of contact for you and to make sure that they're taking care of it, especially when you're having issues with somebody saying, hey, my garment, my decoration didn't hold up like I wanted it to. Well, if when they open the box, they open the package, there is an explicit laundry and care section that they had to see was there before they tossed it out and got to their garment, at least you have some recourse to say, hey, did you treat this thing the way I asked you to treat it? Especially when we're dealing with things like specialty threads, the brushed out animal look. I talked about with Burmalana before with the other fuzzy threads. I know Filane is one that people sometimes use. When we have specialty treatments or specialty materials that may not hold up to normal laundry or normal use, or extreme wear if somebody's doing something to them they shouldn't. So laundry instructions, I think, are cool to use for all sorts of reasons for embroiderers and for apparel decorators in general. But when we're using specialty materials, you may find, and it depends on your material, if you're using Mylar, whatever you're using, you may find that they don't hold up well to standard wash it and forget it and chuck it in the dryer kind of activities. Good way to kind of protect against that. And honestly, like I said, one last time to say, yep, we care about you. Hey, you need to reorder. Here's our contact information. And also remember, this is how you keep your garment looking longer and looking better for longer. And people might think, hey, that's against what they need. They'd love for us to order more, but here they are trying to take care of our garment. They must care. They must actually have some care for us and what we're doing, and they're customer focused. I think that's great. Plus, hey, if you're doing it in flyer style, also advertise something else that is not the kind of garment you sold them on the flyer. All right, folks. So it really just depends. It is one of those things. And by the way, a couple things here. I love this. Terry offered a tip. I love when you guys offer tips. If you have tips for any of this stuff, ways that you use metallics, ways that you use reflectives, things that you do to make them run better, I want to hear them. Terry says, don't wash with other garments that have Velcro on them. Okay, I can see that. Yeah, other garments that have hook and loop or something else that might cause damage to them. And especially when we're talking about, like I said, we're talking about fuzzy things or things that are with brushed animals big time. Because I actually, if you don't know this, if you haven't seen me talk about brushing out the furry animals or fur look when you're doing like the wool blend threads, like I just talked about, the Merlana. I actually, instead of using the brushes, when I was doing it, I was using the hook side of hook and loop to brush out the fibers. That's actually what I used rather than using the sometimes people will have like little metal brushes that they'll use to brush those out and to get those long fibers straightened out. I actually used the hook side of hook and loop to do that work. So if I'm brushing out the fibers with hook and loop, then you wouldn't be surprised that hook and loop can do some stuff to the fibers. So yeah, I was using the hook side of that just to do that in the general sense. Jenny says the home market uses foil balloons instead of Mylar. Yeah, maybe. Like I said, I don't know. Depends. Some like non-standard materials can work. I don't love using them unless I know how they're going to react. And also, if we use them on kids stuff, which a lot of people want to, remember that depending on where you are in the world, there may be rules about things like phthalates or plasticizers, and the material that you use might not be okay to have on kids' garments, and especially not on sleepwear if you're talking about things that have to have like fire safety involved in them. So, like I said, know your material, know what it's being used for. Very different world if it's being used on a backpack, very different world if it's being used on a wall hanger and ornament. Very different thing altogether. But yeah, know what it's being used for and what regulations are for you. I'll always say that for sure. But yeah, like I said, it just depends. It depends on what you think. It depends on what you use. Certainly, something that Jeff said earlier, try all the different materials and try all the different threads and see what works best for you as far as technically what it works. I'm going to say if I look through the things that I've done with metallics, a lot of what I've done, honestly, the classic old school metallics are what I used for a lot of it. If we look at a lot of the pieces that I've done before, I mean, these are all classic old school style metallics with that high shine. If we're talking about how these work for me, what am I doing to make sure I'm not having problems? I'm not having super short stitches. If I pile too much density in one area, I'm going to be likely to get thread breaks. That's also true of standard thread, but especially true of specialty threads, things that have foils, things that are constructions like this have a tendency to snap a little easier if you abuse them, in my opinion and in my experience. But the truth of the matter is, I've had no problem really running metallics as long as I was careful with them. And like I said, even ones that broke easily, some of the ones that I used from the pieces I used for this particular piece, the Paisley Falcon, had all these different colors of metallic and multiple different configurations of stitch types. And the truth of the matter is, I really didn't have too much trouble. But even when they started to break, it was easy for me to diagnose what was going on. Anytime I had really short stitches piled into an area where there's too much density, that's the most likely chance I'm going to get thread breakage, but that is normal. That is for embroidery overall. Or if I was running too fast, because honestly, when I did a couple of these pieces, these are very large pieces. This jacket's a fairly large piece. The wingspan on that is massive. And no lie, you get in a hurry and you get on that full density border and start running as hard as you can, and you're very likely to have issues. So running too fast can cause problems. But most of these classic metallic threads, individually placed stones on some of these as well, not much trouble in general with any of this stuff. And like I said, really it comes down to being careful about your stitch lengths, being careful about your densities. And as you can see, a little goes a long way with shine. You can have some pretty loose densities, and I actually like the look on some of these having fairly loose densities. This is also done on a canvas material. So this material is pretty heavy, pretty coarse, and I used some pretty loose densities and got some awesome shine on that stuff. So like I said, really cool stuff. I don't think it should be something you should be afraid of. Know what things cost, know what runs best for you, understand the differences in the way these things are built, and by all means think, what is it that I can do that is unique with each type of thread? What is it that I can do that doesn't get communicated in any other way? In any case, I hope if you have your own shiny object syndrome that you find something that will hold your attention for a while and find something you can use to hold your customers' attention in the orders to come. As we get up into first the spooky season, reflective stuff is awesome. But when we get up into the rest of the holidays, people love that shine and that shimmer when we're getting into the season of lights. So get out there, grab some metallic, try some new threads today. Look at what you can do as far as adding new applied materials. Think, what exciting can I do? What screams value? What brings someone that little bit of joy, that little bit of novelty, that little bit of discovery that can bring them back and have them loving embroidery the way you do and loving you for making them look good. So, all right, with that, guys, I'm going to let that be it for this Friday. If you have stuff you want to see, you have topics you want me to cover, you have stuff you want to share, if you're watching on the replay, get into the comments, let us know, hit the like button, subscribe if you're on YouTube. It helps us to know and helps me to know what we want to do and what we can do coming forward. Want to hear more from you and interact, and I cannot wait to see you again next week.